Good evening, and welcome to our December and final Maine Book Club meeting for 2023. I'm your host, Bill Nemitz, and this evening we are joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Paul Harding, author of tonight's book, The Other Eden. Paul, who won the Pulitzer Prize in 2010 with his first novel, Tinkers, has done it again with this one, his third novel, a richly woven story about Apple Island just off mid-coast Maine. A story inspired by the real-life story of Malaga Island off Phippsburg. Now, I've seen this book described as, quote, just over 200 pages long, but 600 pages deep, meaning we have a lot to talk about here tonight. But before we get to Paul, who joins us tonight from his home in Long Island, New York, we do have a few housekeeping details to attend to, starting with our sponsors. As always, our deepest gratitude goes to Bull Moose and Coffee by Design for their generous support of the club. Without your help, events like this would not be possible. Thank you both. I also want to recognize our bookstore partners, in addition to Bull Moose, where many of you obtained your copy of This Other Eden. They include Bookstacks in Bucksport, None Such Books and More in South Portland, Mockingbird Bookshop in Bath, Sherman's Maine Coast Bookshops, DDG Booksellers in Farmington, Left Bank Books in Belfast, and Print in Portland. If you have any questions for Paul during our conversation tonight, send it over to us at fun@mainepublic.org, and I'll try to work it into the conversation. Also, I'm sorry to report that Edoardo Ballerini, who narrated the audio version of The Other Eden and was hoping to join us this evening, is under the weather and unable to be here, which I much regret, because I listened to this book on audio, one of the first times I've ever done that, and I found his narration, in addition to Paul's writing, just absolutely riveting. So, Edoardo, we hope you feel better and keep up the great work. But we do have Paul Harding here. So, Paul, welcome.
Well, thanks, Bill. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
It's good to have you. I'd like to begin because we've heard so much about Apple Island, Malaga Island. Let's tell us about the genesis of this book and how this went from an idea to a very renowned novel. How it all began for you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the way I write is sort of, especially when I'm trying to kind of invoke a novel, so I don't really have a story or characters yet. I sort of spend a year or two at a time just throwing everything into the big stock pot. So I was trying to write about a character who I wanted to fit into Tinkers, but Tinkers, my first novel, never quite worked. So I was trying to do something with her. I was writing some scenes set in the town of Enon, which is the fictional town of it's the title of my second novel. Just trying to conjure things. So it's working with some characters and just trying to see if I could invoke just something that sort of gelled, waiting for something to come together. And then I happened to be in a sort of odd way of getting there, but I was reading a book about labor unions, organized labor after the Civil War, as one does. And it was, starting to think about the Civil War and the United States after the Civil War. And it just occurred to me, well, there must have been all Black communities around the country. And then the next thing that occurred to me was there must have been racially integrated communities all around the country. So it was as simple as a Google search that was just the literal racially integrated countries in the United States after the Civil War. And of course, I mean, at the time I was surprised that I was surprised, that just community after community started sort of scrolling down the screen. And Malaga, that's my lousy pronunciation of it, but Malaga Island was one of the first couple dozen communities that came up, and it grabbed my attention because it happened in Maine, and my maternal grandparents are from Maine. My grandmother lived in Dover, Foxcroft for years, and my grandfather was from kind of Dexter and Garland. His family went back and forth. And so Maine sort of has that kind of, already kind of has a lot of real estate in my imagination. Tinkers goes back and forth between Massachusetts and Maine. And then from that too, that one of the families was committed to the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded, which plays a role in Tinkers. One of the characters is going to be committed there by his spouse. And in fact, in my family, that's my great-grandfather had epilepsy, and he was going to be sent to that institution. So I thought, oh, this is more and more interesting, because you have sort of race and integration and these American, perennial American themes, but then there's the kind of already some resonance with subjects that were near and dear to me and that I'd written about. So I felt like, I had coastal New England at my fingertips in terms of just atmosphere and seasons and that kind of thing. And then the thing that really sealed the deal was, not long after finding out about Malaga, I found out that I don't know exactly the chronology of it, but my memory of it is that something like the same summer the folks on Malaga were being evicted, there was occurring in London the first International Congress on Eugenics.
Right.
And I thought, that's it. I'm a goner. It just started haunting me, and I just started thinking about what would it be like? What's a community that, a novel that would be a community of these people on this island with this eviction that was imminent. And just my first thought was just like, I'll just write about the week before they are evicted. So the minute I realized that I was going to be haunted by that, by that idea and by that basic plot, that basic setting, that basic scenario, I stopped doing any more research into Malaga Island. So I think I've read 2, maybe 3 articles. The only one I remember is the Down East magazine one, and we can talk about that as we go, because the photographs.
Why did you do that? Why did you stop doing the resurreach? What's the rationale?
So it's fiction. I'm a fiction writer. So part of it is that I knew I wasn't the person to write the history of Malaga. I don't have any connection to the island or that history, that local history. And as a fiction writer, anyways, one of the kind of not rules, what kind of rules of thumb that I live by and have found works is I always think about the novel the writer Henry James wrote about in one of the prefaces to one of his novels. He said, whenever I find the germ or the kernel of a story from real life that sounds interesting to me, I do just enough looking into it to pique my imagination, but not enough to satisfy it. Mm-hmm. And so there's this sense, as a novelist, you want to have that latitude of imagination to take what's that initially suggestive kind of scenario, but then be able to run it through, in my case, all of the other literary traditions that I read in and that I teach, the Old Testament, Shakespeare, Melville, all these kinds of things, and the art that I look at. And so I wanted the freedom to be able to do that. And I didn't want to, to me, it would have been like sort of, if I was actually trying to find the history of the actual people, the individuals that lived on the island, it wouldn't be appropriate to be subjecting real, historical figures, characters to my kind of literary, what I wanted to do with my literary influence.
Creative spirit. It's interesting because as I told you when we spoke earlier, when I was writing a column for the Press Herald, I had the I don't know if pleasure is the best word, but I had, I guess, maybe the honor of attending the event when Governor John Baldacci went to Malaga Island. I believe it was in 2010 or 12, and apologized to the descendants of those folks on behalf of the state of Maine, and very moving, as you can imagine, just a very, very emotional, moving experience for everyone there. I'll never forget it. And so I understand, having spoken to those people, I understand how deep their feelings run. around the story, which is really one of the most shameful stories in Maine history. And I also want so I can understand their feelings, but what they are essentially saying is that some of the stereotypes that grew out of that era found their way into the book, particularly things like incest and related maladies that come out of that, and felt like the book was resurrecting or perpetuating those myths. But what you're saying is that you didn't know about that, correct?
Yeah, with that, I mean, I've only found out recently that the particulars about the incest stuff, and the incest was the reason why I used that. I mean, there are different reasons. There are two kind of instances of it in the book. One of them is just about a young girl who's sexually assaulted by her father. That actually came from Tinkers. And by one degree of separation from my own family, my great grandfather, who was some sexual predator in the family. I was just thinking about.
You're talking about Esther here, correct?
Yeah. So Esther Honey, one of the characters in the book, she has had a child by her father, and that the first notes that I had from that were I had the idea that she was actually the mother of one of the characters in Tinkers. And something like that had happened, and she had actually pushed her husband off the bluff because he had attacked their daughter in that way. The particulars changed over time, but one of the first images I already had when I was trying to write up was just an image of a woman in a rocking chair on top of a bluff over the Atlantic, sort of looking at where she had pushed her husband off. So that was already there. That's what I brought. I already was working on some of that. And the thing about that was just thinking about, generally just like, women's vulnerability, and just like that idea of just, that the danger that sometimes women are in different communities to sexual assault. And then there's a family in Apple Island in the novel version. They're brother and sister, and they're one of the things about that is, and it's funny because if you go back, there's just one sentence in the whole book that just says they're brother and sister. If you took that sentence out, it would be gone. It would just be evaporated.
This is the Lark family, correct?
The Lark family, and but the reason why I went with that was because it was so prevalent in the rhetoric of eugenics. Right. It was so and that would be something, I mean, it's not eugenics would be all about, it's the purity of blood. And if you have the pollution of the blood, whether it's through, like miscegenation, as it was called, or inbreeding or that sort of thing. So it just seemed like a natural element to put in there, because it would be then when, the book goes back and forth between points of view on the island and then these kind of outside hostile antagonistic points of view. And so those antagonistic points of view would pick up on that sort of thing. So I didn't know that was actually something that was, that was used as a slur or as innuendo or whatever against the actual folks in Malaga. But I mean, to me, it's consistent, at least with it naturally would have been.
Right. Right. Let's talk. I want to just shift gears a little bit but it does play into this somewhat, and that is the whole concept of islands here. We have Malaga Island in this as really the stage for this story. But there's another island. There's the island off Ireland where Bridget comes from.
Grand Blasket.
Yeah. And so islands play, and I was fascinated by the twist where the same thing happened essentially to her island as well. But let's talk about why islands, and you have not been to Malaga Island.
Right. Yeah.
But you describe it as if you've been there. And that tells me that you're somehow, well, first let's talk about the island thing. Talk to me about what it is about an island, in your view, that makes it different from other.
I don't know. It's almost like that's a tradition. It's weird because When I saw that it was an island, my ears sort of pricked up, because I don't know why islands are sort of catnip to writers. So there's something about a kind of isolation, a kind of not like isolation per se, but a kind of there's enough of like a boundary around an island where that you can end up with a sort of community that has its own sort of very, very, culture that's sort of in certain ways distinct from what it would be like on the mainland. It was just also naturally right there as a kind of, a jumping off place, for the imagination for the idea of people who are marginalized. This is kind of in the, kind of in the air, the idea of marginalization. And then I think in the mainland, because that just was the word, whenever I was on the point of view of the island, it's like, oh, the mainlanders. And then you start thinking about who's on whose margins. I started thinking, if I'm on the island, whoever's on the island, they're like, you're on our margins, right? And you're not the mainland. The mainland is your mainland. So I just started thinking about, because a lot of this also is how, with language and all that sort of stuff, how we objectify and dehumanize people, And so I just started thinking from that point of view of just being somebody on the island, and just thinking like, you're marginal to me, and I hope you stay marginal to me, that sort of thing.
Well, that's very much reflected in Esther's reaction when Matthew Diamond and others start coming around, because she feels very protective toward her mainland.
Absolutely, and that's another one of those things. It was so the photographs in that Down East magazine were so suggestive and so evocative. And I'm a junkie for old photographs. Like when I wrote Tinkers, I have all the old photographs of my family, and they're on tin. They're tin types, they're daguerreotypes, and there was one. I had been thinking about that other character who was in her rocking chair up on the bluff, blah, blah. And one of the pictures from, I think it was the Down East article, was of an older woman who was sitting in what kind of looked like a rocking chair, with one or two of her, what looked like grandchildren on her lap. And, what you start doing as a writer is you start thinking about that image, and you think, well, if they were evicted in 1912, this is probably earlier than 1912. So it's very early photography. And so then if they're on an island, in 19 whatever it was, you're not just walking around with a little camera taking snapshots on the island. Like whatever the camera was, it would have been a huge, like, I was just thinking, who's there? How, this is not a casual visit and like, oh, I'm just taking a snapshot, just visiting. So I just started, and this is what you do as a fiction writer. I just like eventually in my imagination walked around from behind the photograph and got behind this woman sitting in the chair and thought, here's this person with this huge camera, and there are other people there, and that it's not good, right? And then eventually, it takes long. It takes, because you have to get to know characters the way that you get to know real people in real life. So you don't feel like you're just assigning, here, you hit this mark and say this line. And so essentially, essentially what you do is you just sort of say, what do you think of all this? And just the kind of the impression that I got, she just said, get the hell off my island.
What are you doing? Get out of here soon enough. Well, that's a great segue, because there are so many rich characters in this story, and I want to make sure that we touch on at least my favorites.
No, sure.
I want to start with Matthew Diamond,
Mm-hmm.
who is it strikes me as just a very complex, somewhat tortured individual who seems caught between saving these islanders on the one hand and being quietly repulsed by them on the other. And as I got to know him, although I always felt like I want to, like, how much can I get to know him, because he's the outsider, he's coming in. But as I did, I was trying to go back to that character development process on your part and wonder what writ large, or who writ large, is Matthew Diamond. What does he represent beyond that island in your view?
Yeah, well, hopefully, I mean, the way that I write characters is I don't start with what they represent. I don't want them to be reducible. I mean, that I spent a lot of time trying to make him so you can't quite dismiss him as a pure villain.
That's why I'm asking you.
Yeah, and you can't excuse him, because as a writer, that's what you want, because if somebody knows, oh, he represents this, you don't never have to think about them again, and then they turn into like a flat kind of. But he and I mean, I remembered from that article, that there were missionaries, there's school teachers there. There was a school that actually was quite respectable. From what I remember, people actually paid like a small tuition and that was a very striking, that was one of the other, maybe the most striking photo is of a group of school children who sort of presented in the, the tone of their skin, all the way from, Caucasian to Black African, African American. But then I was just thinking about the best intentions and this kind of invasiveness, and you sort of come in and your best intentions just are what actually just precipitate catastrophe. And so I gave him, there's a couple of, one is that I've spent many years reading many thousands of pages of the Swiss theologian Karl Barth's theology, whatever. And he was a member of what was called the Confessing Church, which during World War II was one of the only institutions in Germany who actually actively tried to help Jews escape Hitler's Third Reich. So after many years of reading thousands of pages of his, of his theology, I just came upon a letter in which, he was describing, how thankful he was that like my son, I'm so grateful that my son is not afflicted with this awful, this affliction that I have, which is the visceral repulsion I feel when I'm in the presence of a living Jew. And there's something about just that living Jew, like it was so atrocious and so appalling. But then you turn back and you're like, he's one of the only people that did anything during World War II.
Yeah,
the one doesn't cancel the other, and so that's perfect for a character. And so I just literally gave that to Matthew Diamond. He writes the equivalent of that line about how he feels revulsion towards Black people, just to a friend of his. And what made him, I think what makes him, again, complicated is that he knows it.
Yes.
He knows he's racist and he hates it. And nevertheless, and I think that's a
lot of the tension that emanates from him.
And I think that's just one of those things as a writer that, you're always looking for, like, oh, what is a universally recognizable human condition or whatever. It's something like, we all know better than we always act, anywhere from like, I know I shouldn't be smoking, to like, I know I shouldn't be like eating all these donuts, to I know I shouldn't have left my brother to die by the roadside. Like, it's scalable, so I just found that really compelling. I also sort of got that from Shakespeare. His villains are great because his villain, like Macbeth, Macbeth's like, I know I'm going to go straight to hell if I murder the king, and he murders the king and he goes straight to hell. The whole time he's like still doing it and totally knows what's happening. And there's something very, very there's a dramatic tension in that that's really, really wonderful. If you sort of get some of it in a bottle, as they say.
Sure. Let's move on to Ethan, who is another of my, I mean, really in some ways, well, I guess Esther as well, but Ethan and Matthew emerge as two of certainly the major characters in this story. And I was struck by the way you describe his artistic talent, or as an extension of that, how he sees the world, right down to the very essence of how he sees light, which was absolutely fascinating. How he was always examining things for what the source of the light was, how the light refracted, what his universe was built around light. Now, and you describe the paintings that he creates, whether it's a lot of it, well, on the island, and also when he goes to Massachusetts, I was really fascinated by the hayfields and the way he set out for that short time that he was in Massachusetts, how you describe these hayfields.
An American still life and landscape painter named Charles Ethan Porter who was active in the 19th century. And I actually have the painting here. I can show you. I don't know if there would be glare, but he had this wonderful painting of haystacks. Like, yeah, so I actually had the scenes that I was trying to write that were in Enon from my second novel, and just had characters sort of out having a picnic in the meadow, and I knew they were mowing the meadow. And when I saw that painting, I thought, he's looking at that meadow that they're in. And so I just had one of the characters just one day look up and go, who's that guy out painting the meadow? Yeah. And somebody says, oh, that dad's got, when I found Malaga, and then when I went back to that scene, the next time I went back to that scene, I realized that person is from Malaga Island. I mean, from Apple Island in the novel. Yeah. And a lot of what the next years of writing the book were going to consist of was discovering how he got from Apple Island to Enon.
Yes.
So it's just, a lot of these things are you just keep working stuff up, and you hope that it finally kind of weaves together eventually.
The asparagus.
And so, yeah, and I really love to,
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's another thing so that's a painting by a Dutch painter named Adrian Court. There's only like 25 or 26 of his paintings, well, maybe a few more, known to exist, and they're all these very tiny little still lifes of like bundles of asparagus or like 3 grapes or something like that. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of thing where, and that's what I even mean what I was saying earlier about like having the latitude for the imagination, is like, I want to be able to do these things with these painting, think about painting, think about art, think about all these things with the sort of freedom that a novel allows.
Yeah. As Ethan continued on his adventure, he was going to be going to art school, and he was, there's a whole future opening up for him. Mm-hmm. I was somewhat, and this was probably intentional on your part, stunned when, boom, Ethan's gone.
Yeah, I was too.
For the rest of the story.
I was too.
Was that painful for you to let him go?
Oh yeah. But it was one of those things too, you learn like as a writer, like, oh my, that's really, there's something very powerful about it. And as long as you're not doing it for cheap effect, like he really did leave the novel, but I had some very, very interesting editorial conversations, not with the person who ended up editing it, but some earlier folks who were looking at it. And they just said, you can't have major characters just leaving and I said, one just did. And part of it is, I think if you go through the novel, one of the things I like to do is just be able to move around points of view and just move from character to character. And there is a way where there's a certain point at which you realize you're following the story. And so certain characters drop out of the story. So for example, I was just thinking about this yesterday, Matthew Diamond, like once some of the kind of climactic action happens in the end, the book just never goes back to him. You don't have the big teary goodbye. I'm so sorry for all this. It's like, literally, sorry, man, you are not the story.
Right.
These people on this island, they are the true subjects. I stick with them. That's who I'm loyal to. That's whose stories I'm following.
Although I must say, I was a little grateful when you hinted late in the book and that Ethan fought in the Battle of Ardennes at the beginning of World War I.
That's one of those little things where I was like, well, there's got to be a little bit of it's just something. It can't just drop off. But when people talk about, say, where did he go? Why didn't you just tell the reader where he went? There isn't a person listening or watching tonight who doesn't have that, remember that guy, Tommy, that lived down at the end of the block there whatever happened to him? Nobody knows. People come in and out of your life the way that I had them come in and out of the book. Esther's son, Ethan's dad, there's Ethan and he has 2 sisters. There's no mother. Right. The book never even mentions I've taken to calling it the Queen Lear move. Yes. Which is like, nobody ever asks where Queen Lear is, right? Those girls should have had a mother around. They would have been much better behaved. It's just like Shakespeare wasn't writing that play.
and it was it Anna Parker? Was that the name? Do I have it correctly? The woman who
Oh,
lived
Annie. Yeah.
Annie.
Yeah.
Again, she was kind of an enigma as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
She was
Well,
there.
all these people, you start to come up with like these, the dramatis persona. I mean, the book ended up being like the whole first part of the book is basically just being introduced to all the different characters. Like I kept thinking, oh, well, I'll get to that and I'll put more plot in it. It just kind of ended up just being like, no, like you actually, it's true. The way that novels work too is the longer you just spend with people, the more they feel like real people. And that's one of the things that had to be, that one of the, if this novel was going to work, the whole thing was about not like the terrible thing that happened to the people. It's the people to whom it happened. So you can't, like, otherwise you just intellectually know, oh, isn't that unjust? Isn't that terrible? Isn't that tragic? You just know it intellectually. But if you've actually just spent 150 pages just with them,
they are
dealing with each other, talking with each other, raising kids, trying to pay the rent, do whatever, that sort of thing. Then this terrible thing happens to them. It hits you, it hits your heart, it hits your soul. It's not just intellectual. So that's just dramatically kind of how that works, for sure.
I have one reader question here that kind of touches on all of this, because we could go down through Zachary is another fascinating character. Does the author have a favorite character of his own? Is there one of them to whom you most closely had the most affection identified with?
Well, as a reader, to me, the novel revolves around Esther, even though she's not always front and center, because she was the character that I couldn't quite get right for Tinkers. I really wanted, I had a whole other like quarter to a third of the book Tinkers that was devoted to this woman. And I just, every time the book fully went over to her, everything else went off axis. So it didn't take long for me to realize, like, Esther is this grandmother, this mother, this matriarch that I've been trying to find where she is, just in, all three of my novels that I've published are all kind of interconnected in different ways. And there she was. And I just loved her. And I think of her as a prophet. She's like an Old Testament prophet, which is, the kind of hallmark of prophecy is not that you sort of magically can tell the future. It's not fortune telling. It's that you see what the present is clearly.
Right.
It's not what it's going to be. You see where it's at, man. And if you can see where it's at, it's not a mystery where it's going to head. And that's what I just had that moment of, like, the second she sees this missionary, she's like, we're screwed. We're in trouble. We're in trouble. And I just she's the center of gravity. I love all the other characters. You have to love the other characters. Sure. And when I was working on each one, I loved them more than any, but I think to me, she's the true north.
Well, she has a mystical side to her as well.
Yeah.
It's not all practical. And I mean, when she looks at Matthew and figuratively and maybe sometimes literally sees the ghost of her father, as a threat. And also when she tells the hurricane story, it's it almost feels like an out-of-body experience that she's having.
And that was really, I mean, that whole opening is just, it's a mix of different things. As a writer, you just want to write stuff that you think is beautiful and wonderful, and it's from things that moved you. So I thought it's like their own book of Genesis. It's like their own beginning. Like, this is what the island, in the beginning, this sort of thing. And then that opening storm scene is like the flood. And so then I thought, oh, well, then in that case, then the island is almost like Noah's Ark. And then, if this island that was originally their sanctuary, they are able to get off of, go onto the quote unquote mainland less and less, then it becomes more like a prison, or it becomes an exile, and then that's another thing, thinking about, like, in the Old Testament, Israel is this tiny, vanishingly small little population of people who is always on the verge of extinction, of extermination, right? And in the Bible, and weirdly, and again, this is another thing with the insight, like in the Bible, there's a number of places where just when the entire nation is going to evaporate, there's some very untraditional coupling of people, like Lot and his daughters, and Judah and Tamar, and Amnon and Tamar, the other Tamar, which is Absalom, like with Faulkner. So again, it's just, and then I just thought, okay, so this big opening storm sequence that I just wanted to write like a big virtuosic, like I wanted to just see if I could write like a big crazy storm, just because everything else I write is just like birch bark metaphysics. Yeah. But while I was writing it, I was thinking, oh, you know what, she's telling it. Like it's going to pan back and it's going to prove to have been heard. And when she tells it, she starts telling it in the third person, like, Patience and Benjamin. I kept those first names, but but then she starts using the first person. She starts saying, I did this and I did it. So there's that like kind of coextensivity of all the different generations, And
so what was striking about that for me was when that happened, I flew right over it. It didn't catch until later you address it. You address how she used to do that. And my reaction to that was, oh yeah, she did that.
Yeah.
It shows how much she embodied what's Patience is going to.
And that's what I mean about all these different layers that, you want to be free to let them intermingle and see what happens. Because as a writer, I'm always looking for the material to start all these different layers we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. I want them to become coextensive. I want them to become implicated in one another, because that's one of the ways where, in my experience, it's one of the ways that you have the best chance of ending up with a novel that's better than what you thought it was. Yeah. Like it just starts generating these really cool, amazing, moving, hopefully artful, hopefully soulful kinds of things that you couldn't just, again, theoretically, intellectually think up and then just type out. So it's it's a revelation, that kind of thing. So, and then
one thing that struck me about Esther too was, and we all do this was what struck me about it, is there'll be a moment where things are proceeding sequentially and boom, 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 happening one right after another. But in the middle of that, she will have what seems like an extraordinarily long sequence of thoughts, all in rhythm with what's happening. And it might seem implausible, but then I sat back at one point and I thought, we all do that. Yeah. Maybe it's thinking while the other person's talking or whatever it might be, but we all are carrying on very often 2 or 3 conversations, one with someone in front of us, others with ourselves at the same time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the way that thought works and memory works and dreams work, which is that you can, you can go from right now and back to when you're 8 years old, and then over there to when your mom told you a story. You can do it all kind of like instantly. And so figuring out how to do that in prose that the reader is just reading kind of a line at a time. Yeah. Again, it's just one of the the engrossing pleasures and satisfactions of trying to and then that's actually one of the places where you get character, because you realize, you start realizing, oh, it's associative. And so when she thinks of this or she thinks of that, that is actually character. Like, I didn't think of that. She thought of it. That's what you're trying to get to with these, knowing these people.
I want to talk a little bit about mechanics before we stop, but I also, there's one other character that we got to talk about, Zachary.
Yeah.
My wife read the book before I did. In fact, I waited, because I always like to wait until just before, or listen to it in this case. But she said, make sure you ask him, tell me what's with the tree.
Oh, that's so.
What inspired the tree?
So with Zachary, he really was somebody who I found what I wanted a character to be doing. So I had to make up a character to do it. And so he actually kind of got conjured in a way that's usually like the opposite direction, because usually it's I just start with the person and I build up. But this was, I started with an activity. So that's another thing, another piece of art. I was in the in this art gallery of Ontario up in Toronto, and they have a collection of medieval ivory carvings that look kind of like this. Again, sorry about the lousy graphics, but
it's these.
Oh yeah. So that's just an old diptych. You can see the scene. You can see the hinge in the middle of it, so to open and close like a book. And that's all hand carved out of ivory. And I just thought, wow, wouldn't it be cool if somebody was doing that in a tree?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was like, that's another thing where I didn't do any research, because I was like, I bet you can if you really look into it. But in my book, because every novel has its own inner realism. What is realistic for the world of the novel. And so I just started thinking, and I just started looking, at those carvings, and I just started thinking about, him being meditative, and it almost being like devotional, religious, and active obedience, as they would call it, and just, and what he took pleasure in. I think he takes pleasure in doing people's hands, because they're so expressive. And then he started to emerge out of that, because again, it's meditative. It's sort of, and I imagine him in the tree, and I imagine all the kids like throwing crab apples at him or whatever they do with him, and just, but then slowly he can't, it turns out that he was very instrumental in Esther's life, and really actually has cared for her.
Kind of a surrogate
for
father.
many years. Say that again?
It's kind of a surrogate father to her.
Yeah, and like he became a surrogate father to Eha too, who's Esther's son. Yeah. So he had a more profound.
Not father, but you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, and more profound, until toward the end he has this very kind of, again, kind of climactic kind of monologue that he utters, and to me he was like Isaiah or Jeremiah from the Bible, just like telling truth to power, just saying, you people are criminals, you're murderers,
Well, before we leave Zachary behind, I'd want to talk about the ending, which just took my breath away. And literally the ending, where he is I think it was the last, was it the grave diggers or the guys who burned down the houses, who see him in the water?
It's one of the grave diggers, yeah.
The one that stays,
excavators.
Yeah, that's right. The grave robbers, actually.
Yeah, grave robbers.
He's walking into the water against the tide, and what reemerges at that moment but the flag, that patchwork flag that really comes to embolize the whole of Apple Island, and the parallels between that and Patience holding the flag aloft during the hurricane. On the water's the exact same image. When did that come into full circle for you? Was that something that you planned at the beginning? Was this how?
No, that's something that it came pretty late. But boy, when it came like a kabam. It was like, being struck by lightning. It just seemed apt, and I was trying to figure out how to end it. The ending was just originally them sort of sailing off. And I just thought, no, there needs to be like a coda. There needs to be a kind of, and so I just started to get these, like, here's the island belted in night, just kind of like, and in a year, you won't be able to tell anybody who was ever here.
Kind of the fade to black kind of thing.
Yeah, almost. But then there's like, the grave, the grave digger, which is like I just thought, I love the grave digger scene in Hamlet. And there's some of the most kind of metaphysical kind of, musing about fate and about our lives, our human careers on this planet. And I just thought, and that is one of the things I remembered from the article, is that they just dug up all the graves, and just, as far as I remember, they just tossed them into one grave and just like put a stone in.
They were intermingled.
Yeah. I was just like, whatever, so it was just so striking that and then I thought, who'd you get to do that work? And those people were probably as hapless as anybody else you could find too. So it just seemed like that there's some kind of, just this kind of like final coda that's concluding. And then I just thought of, everybody else is left, and there's Zachary, and he can't, I just thought, he can't stay. Right. And then I thought, well, I had all these other scenes where they're going back and forth, and if it's really low tide, in the book anyways, if it's really low tide, you can kind of wade. And I just thought, well, he wouldn't have much stuff. He lives in a tree, and I thought he just needed those, handkerchiefs or something. And I thought, it's the flag. He has Patience flag, and just like, and then and then all I realized is that I had to, I don't know if it's the last word in the book, but I just realized, okay, it's the flag. The book opens with the flag in the flood, and so it has to end with the word flood. And he's pushing against the flood, whatever,
Right.
Yeah, and I was just like, that's it. I couldn't have thought that up. It's just, as a writer, you're always looking for the story and the characters to just end up having their own inner coherence, that you just end up feeling like you're just kind of there, okay, is that how you want to do it? Is that, because it just has its own inner coherence or inner logic. You're just trying to follow it,
I think that's when the story starts writing itself, right? Yeah.
That's what that's what they mean when they say that. I think that's also, I was just thinking, it took 10 years to write this thing because it kind of takes that long to get to know characters. The way it takes as long to get to know characters as it does real people, know. And that's what I really wanted to do, is no matter, I wanted to write a book. I knew it was, writing about race and about this very tragic thing, and it's not going to smooth everybody's fur over. And I just wanted to make sure, man, if I put this out in the world, I want to just, say, I take responsibility for every sentence in this thing. And I want, the ideal, you can't ever quite hit the ideal, but you're going for it, which is that, I just want anybody reading the book to come away just thinking those characters were given the absolute courtesy and, and dignity and respect. And the book never did anything at their expense, never set them up to knock them down, and did the same to the reader. Never is always courteous to the reader, never jerks the reader around, never tries to coerce the reader into consenting to anything, try to make it so it's like an experience, and the reader just goes through it and comes out the other end, and they can make anything they want of it,
Your writing, I'm going to close with this, or maybe one other question too, but your writing is, people compared it to Faulkner. You have long paragraphs. You don't use any or very few quotation marks, but yet there's a rhythm to it. I understand that you, in your previous life, you were a drummer. Is that right? And I'm wondering, does that impact your writing?
Absolutely.
The sense of rhythm that you get
every
from
syllable. Yeah. Very, so, when you're a drummer, you're known as the timekeeper, right? So when you're keeping time playing drums, there's the tempo, but you can push it a little forward, you can pull it back, you can cut it in half, you can double it, you can do all these sorts of things. And with writing a novel, you're just doing that with narrative. It's people in time. And so you can have these, you can have something where 100 years pass in a paragraph, but then you can have 10 pages, which are one moment that was arrested in time. That's what I do with photographs a lot, that you could just keep parsing stuff out and no time passes. And then, it's almost like improvising with music, where I often hear, I know what the rhythm is, I know what the tempo is, I know what the time signature or whatever you call all that stuff. I kind of know like what the beat is of a lot of sentences before I know what they are literally about.
Yeah. As an aside to that, I have to, I wish Edoardo was here, because I told you, we spoke earlier, I'm not an audio book guy, but when I was originally going to be with us tonight, I thought, I'm going to give this a try. And he nailed it. I mean, it was so easy to listen to. And I'm wondering, did you play a role in that? Do you pick the person who, how does that work?
I had the good fortune of Norton sent me 5 or 6 samples of professional readers. And you had, some of them, I mean, some of the readers were spectacular, but since my writing is sort of pitched in a certain way, if somebody was particularly super dramatic, it could go over the top a little bit, and I just heard Edoardo reading, I can't remember what the sample they sent me. I was just like, the minute I heard him reading, I just said, that's it. He's the one. He's just brilliant, just brilliant. And I had the traumatic experience of, I've done a million readings in public, and I was like, I'm pretty good. And I was a drummer in a rock band. Like, I know how to play to the back rows, that stuff. And I can do. So I actually did the audiobook for Enon, the second novel, and it was a nightmare because I got into the booth, all the contracts were signed. I got into the booth and I started reading, and I realized this is not about being a good reader. It's about being a voice actor. It's about acting. And it was just an exercise in well,
To the point where
humiliating.
Eduardo, he takes on the voices of other characters, and they are throughout the book consistent and distinguishable. So
It's
you know,
almost like he does what you would do like in an opera, right? With leitmotifs,
right,
they're called, which is,
right,
you hear him hit a certain note or whatever, and you just get habituated to, oh, that's Esther,
yeah.
or that's this other
Right.
character. It's
You
just,
don't have to introduce it or attribute it. Yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
it's just sublime.
let me close with one other question, and it struck me as 100 years ago. Fast forward to today, and you look at the racial tensions that we have in this country. You look at here in Portland, and I'm sure down your way, all over the country. You look at these emerging homeless encampments, which are
Yeah.
islands by themselves in
Yeah.
these mostly urban settings. What might we learn? I hate to throw that at you because a story stands on its own, but I kept being struck by how it feels sometimes like we're just going around in big circles on some of these
I know
things.
that's a big can of worms to open, right?
You got the
Because,
outcasts.
well, I think, especially with like a novel, it's really hard because you don't want to, you can lapse into propaganda really easily, and again, like that's why I don't want it to be a point. I don't want there to just be a message, but I also want it to be something that it doesn't blink. And the way that, at least again, the fictional treatment of this kind of very unfortunately familiar and recognizable fate of people and socioeconomic class, like sort of working class or working poor, that sort of thing. And you just see it happening over and over and over and over and over again. And so you realize something could be done, but it's not done, in some ways. It's like there's something that, the people who enjoy the privilege, the material privilege, benefit from a certain system that has this kind of thing built into it one way or another. I think that's what a lot of Shakespeare's plays are, late plays are. They're just like, geez, monarchy, the king, having a king means that the kingdom is going to keep falling apart, so it's not such a great thing when they say, let's just build the kingdom again. It's like, but I think that what I tried to do too is just show that and again, not tell anybody. I just I think the most powerful thing you do as a writer is you can show people, you can describe experiences to people, and they will see them and they will recognize that they're true. And then it can resonate through them however it does, and they can do what, But just one of the things that I think is, that's just, it's one of these perennial sorts of things, questions or observations, problems. It's almost built in to the human situation, which is, there are few things that are easier than withholding somebody else's humanity for the authentication of your own humanity, and it's as easy as tying your shoe, is just sort of saying, you've got mixed blood, you've got polluted blood, you're poor, you're ragged, you're this, you're that, and I'm not. At least I'm not that, And so it's just like the ease with which people dehumanize one another is just, it's really baffling. It's just astonishing. And that's one of the things we don't have time, but that's one of the things I was doing with eugenics too, because right now we have this kind of ongoing false dilemma between religion and science. It's just like they're just two different idioms, right? But you can take science and exterminate how many millions of people, right, technologically, and whatever, because they are the inferior race or whatever, just as much as you can have a religious crusade and wipe out all the infidels or whatever. It's not science that does that, it's not religion that does that, it's people who do that through these different idioms that they use to justify murder and bigotry and all those dreadful things that we just see throughout history.
Yeah. Oh, we could go on all night here, but unfortunately, I think we've run out of time.
Well, that's too bad. I feel like we've just gotten under sail.
I know. I have the same feeling. This book is going to. I'm going to be thinking about this book for a long time. I'll tell you that. There's no question.
Well, that's wonderful to hear as a writer.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, Paul, I want to thank you for joining us. It's been a real pleasure hearing your thoughts and just getting to know these characters. As I said, I have my favorites, but the whole group of them are just an amazing collection of people. So my congratulations. It was a great job.
Well, and thank you, Bill. I'm delighted to have been invited. This was a wonderful conversation.
Well, thanks. I'm going to sign off here with another shout out to our sponsors, Bull Moose and Coffee by Design. Thanks again for your support for this series. And I'm happy to announce that the Maine Public Book Club and I will be returning in 2024. If you have a suggestion for a book that you'd like us to feature next year, please do so. You can shoot Sophie at Maine Public a note, and that would be to swood@mainepublic.org. That's swood, W-O-O-D, at mainepublic.org. All of our 2023 book club conversations are archived at mainepublic.org. You can click on community and then the book club link, and you'll find them there. I am Bill Nemitz. This year has been a pleasure. It's flown by. I'm looking forward to another great one. And thank you again, Paul, and I wish you all a great holiday season. Good night.